In this video, we're going to review gameplay for the deck White-Red Prison. The variation that I use in the deck is a little bit different than what other people use. So instead of running 4 Blood Moons, I only ran 3 because I found that Blood Moon is either very good against a deck or is very bad against a deck. And there's not a whole lot of in-between, so I figured that 4 was just too much overkill. I'm also running 2 Wall of Omens, which I find is very good against aggressive decks that attack you early on. Now, most people don't use this card because they rather have no creatures at all because they figure it's going to board wipe themselves and having a creature out is pointless, but there's a lot of aggressive decks out there nowadays, like especially with Death Shadow, and having Wall of Omens to block is very, very good. And plus, I like to think that it makes my opponent think twice about removing their fatal pushes from their deck going into game 2, knowing that I have Wall of Omens in the deck. I'm also running 2 Leyline of Sanctity's main deck. Now, some White-Red Prison decks do this, most of them do not. But I find that with just so many Death Shadows decks out there and Abzan decks and Jund decks, being able to stop the Inquisitions and their Thought Seizes is really useful. Other than that, it's a pretty typical White-Red Prison deck. Runs 25 lands, 4 of them being fetches, 4 of them being Temple of Triumphs, 4 of them being Rugged Prairie. Not all White-Red Prison decks use 4 Rugged Prairies, but it's so good that it's worth running 4 of. As for Planeswalkers, I run 4 Nahiris, 2 Chandras, 1 Ajani, and 2 Gideon Juras. Now, there's a lot of variation when it comes to what Planeswalkers are in a White-Red Prison deck, but prior to the release of Amonkhet and Gideon the Trials, I feel like this is the best combination possible. As for the sideboard, we have a lot of cool cards because White has access to a lot of really good sideboard cards. First off, we have 3 Rest in Pieces in the sideboard, which does a good job at shutting down decks that use a graveyard because there is absolutely no graveyard involvement in this deck whatsoever. Next, we have 2 Stony Silences and 1 Shattering Spree. Now, most people don't use Shattering Spree and they stick with 3 Stony Silences, but I find that Shattering Spree works really well in this deck. So even though we have Chalice of the Void, which will counter our Shattering Spree, when you replicate the Shattering Spree, the replicated copies are not countered by Chalice. So say, for example, you pay 3 red, the first one gets countered, the next 2 go through, so you'll be able to destroy 2 of your opponent's artifacts. So it still works well in this deck. And the last thing I want to point out before getting into the gameplay is that this deck runs 3 defense grids in the sideboard. Now, I've never really heard of another White-Red Prison deck running defense grids in the sideboard, but I find that it works really well against counter decks, and so that's why I have it there, because it makes them pay 3 extra to counter one of your spells. So yeah, so let's take a look at the gameplay. The first matchup here is against Naya Burn. And you're going to find that this is a pretty one-sided match. So let's take a look here. Now, this first thing is a Wall of Omens, and that's to stop any small creatures from coming out. And it does a pretty good job. Plus, we get to draw a card, which is pretty cool, too. So you see the Goblin Guy come out, but he can't really attack with it because then Wall of Omens is just going to block. And also, Goblin Guy is really bad against our deck because our deck has 25 lands. So you'll see here, we pull lands on both of them. So Goblin Guy against us isn't really worth attacking. And then Anger of the Gods comes around just to make sure they can't deal any damage to us. And with Blood Moon out, it's really hard for them to play all their cards. And yeah, I mean, this is what it's like to play White-Red Prison. I mean, just you lock down your opponent, and at this point in the game, we have the advantage because we have better late game stuff. And it's a bit boring, but it's like if you're trying to win. And plus, I'm bitter because I had that whole breaking and entering deck that I spent a week on, and then the day I make it, Wizards bans it. It's like, so it's that kind of bitterness that drove me to make this deck. So after finishing off our opponent, we now go into game 2, and we get a Leyline on the opening hand, so yeah. And that's going to get very hard for our opponent to win now, just because they can't target us. And now we're able to drop Chalice of the Void. And remember, half of their cards in their deck cost 1, and the other half cost 2. So if we're able to get both of our Chalices out, then there's really not much they can do. And so here they waste 2 burn spells just to get rid of Wall of Omens. And nothing we can really do here, so we just wait. And that's the cool thing about this deck is that even if you get really bad pulls, you can still win. So now we drop our second Chalice, and opponent just concedes because when their whole deck is 1 and 2 drops, it's like, what can you do? Now this match is a little more interesting. This one is against Eldrazi and Taxes. So this first game we actually win, but it's pretty close because it is hard when they keep putting constant pressure on you with creatures, and you have things like Thalia, which shuts down a lot of our cards or makes it hard to play a lot of our cards. But having Blood Moon and Board Wipe also help in the matchup. So they're actually able to get rid of our Blood Moon for now and play their cards. So Flicker Wisp is pretty good against us, especially when they have Flicker Wisp against our Planeswalkers. That also makes it really hard for us as well. But having all the board wipe that we have makes it hard for our opponent to win here. So they're pretty clever here, and they're able to save their Eldrazi Displacer by using their Flicker Wisp, which not a lot of people would figure out, I don't think. Alright, so just able to slowly grind away at our opponent. They have one creature left in their hand, draw another card. But this is kind of what Prison is. It's just constantly being on the defense and hoping that at the last minute you can turn things around and then turn the tables against your opponent. And that's what we're seeing here, is that they're down to 0 cards in hand besides this Thought-Knot Seer. And we have a Planeswalker out, so Planeswalker versus Thought-Knot Seer. And now we're forcing him to attack because Gideon Jura's ability forces your opponent to attack for the +2 ability. And now we just block with Simian, but since his creature's tapped, we use Gideon to finish him off. And Gideon really is like a tank because like he comes in with 6 loyalty, and if you do the +2, he's already an 8 on the first turn, so it's very hard to deal with. So even with Gideon the Trials coming out, I feel like I should still keep in at least 1 Gideon Jura. So 2 creatures versus 2 Planeswalkers, and both Planeswalkers are able to destroy creatures, so yeah, it's not good for our opponent at this point, even though they keep playing creatures, which makes it hard on us. But again, and we get the board wipe again, just 2 Planeswalkers out when they have nothing, it's game. So game 2, we actually lose this one pretty badly, and mainly it's because our lands get really messed up by our opponent, because they do get the Arbiter out pretty early, and they're able to get rid of one of our lands or 2, and then, yeah. So it's a pretty boring game 2. Yeah, and so for a deck with 25 lands, it actually gets mana screwed quite a bit. You know, it's hard when all your cards cost, like, most of them cost 3 or 4. So very, very one-sided match here. Not able to do anything. Play the Wall of Omens, but then immediately they're able to get rid of the Wall of Omens. So they path to exile, we can't search. And yeah, just nothing happened. We're down to 4 life. We're trying to come back. We're trying to play Anger of the Gods, but then they still follow up with another creature. And then finally, so they aren't able to do it here, but eventually they will play their Thought-Knot Seer with their other Aether Violet's already on 4 right now. And there's nothing we can really do at that point. So, I mean, I have to say that this deck is like, you lose a lot with this deck. Like, it just feels like you lose. Like, even when you win, it feels like you're losing. Because a lot of the games that you win, you're down to like 6, 7 life before you're able to turn things around. So here we lose. So now we're in game 3, so we will win this one. And we have a pretty good start here. We're able to do Wall of Omens. Now, this is why Wall of Omens is so good, because not only is it a good blocker, but you're able to draw a card, and that's really helpful in this deck where you need to have so many pieces for it to work. You need to have all the lands, you need to have good defense, and then you need the Planeswalkers. So Lightning Helix is creature, but we see one come immediately after, same creature. But now we have Nahiri, and we have Wall of Omens as well. So we're going to be able to block the Eldrazi Displacer if he tries to attack with it. So yeah, so you Flicker Wisp the Nahiri, which is a pretty smart idea because it removes all the loyalty counters from it. Then it comes back in with 4. But we do board wipe him. And it's an uphill battle for him now because creatures versus Planeswalkers, the Planeswalkers just can do a lot more. We get lucky and pull an Anger of the Gods, which I guess isn't really that lucky when you have 3 Anger of the Gods main decks, 2 Wrath of Gods main deck, but then we pull in a 3rd Wrath of God from the sideboard, so I guess it's not really that much luck when you have that many board wipes in your deck. And now here, this is where Gideon works well. So Gideon made it so our opponent had to attack us with both the creatures, and since Nahiri's already on 8, they can't really do anything at that point, and Nahiri's going to get an Emrakul out. So now we're playing against Burn again, so apparently there's a lot of Burn out there now. Well, there's always been a lot of Burn. I used to play Burn. It was really cool, but then it gets boring after a while because it's like the same thing over and over again. You just kind of hope that your opponent isn't faster than you are. Like, you know, Ad Nauseam was pretty hard to play. So here they're off to a pretty good start, but we do have Chalice in our hand. So if we're able to play Chalice and then board wipe them, we have the advantage here. So Chalice comes out. That's going to shut down half their deck already. Now in response to their Lightning Helix, we Lightning Helix their Eidolon, and plus we gain 3 life from that, so that helps. But right now it's a pretty close call, but we actually are going to win this game, even though we're down to 5 life against Burn and they have 3 cards in hand. So that's pretty cool. Now we have Chandra out. We have it down to 1 loyalty, so it's pretty at risk for dying, but we have a lot more Planeswalkers to back it up. And with the second Chalice, their whole deck shut down. Even though we're at 2 life, we still win. And that's the fun of White-Red Prison. So game 2, we will actually win this one as well. We have Leyline in the opening hand, and like we saw before, when you have Leyline out against Burn, it's not really a fair matchup at this point. Now, this guy does actually have a lot of answers for our stuff. I think he plays at least 2 or 3 Destructive Revelries against us, And plus he has Core Firewalker. Now Core Firewalker is good against a burn mirror because the only way they can really kill opponent's creatures are with red cards. But we have other things to kill creatures. And so we have Blessed Alliance, which forces them to sacrifice it. Not really the best option against us. So now Ajani's out, and we have a pretty good shot at winning here. They were able to kill our Leyline of Sanctity, but now there are Planeswalkers soaking up burn, and it's only a matter of time before we pull another Planeswalker, so yeah. And they're already down to 1 card. So they did have a lot of stuff to use against us, but at the expense of dealing burn damage to us, because we're at 15 life, they're at 1 card. It's like advantages for us here. And even though they have Eidolon out, the Eidolon's actually hurting them because we have the life advantage here, and plus we have so much life gain in this deck, or a good amount. We have Lightning, Helix, and Ajani. But we just get rid of the Eidolon just in case here, but then he comes back with the Destructive Revelry, gets it back. But just, you see him just wasting so much of his efforts on just dealing with us instead of focusing on just getting rid of our life. And now with Gideon, very good Gideon, he kills this tapped Eidolon, and it dodges the whole burn thing because it doesn't take damage because it's more than 3. We get down to 1 life, but at this point we make Gideon a creature and he can't do anything at this point. The last deck we're going to look at is Eldrazi E-Tron. Now this is a really rough matchup for us. Even though we have Blood Moons, the fact that they don't really have anything that costs 1 or very few things that cost 1 makes it really hard for us. So, and also late game, normally we have the advantage because like against burn decks, it's like, you know, they're playing these 1-drops and when we're playing these 4-drops, but against Eldrazi E-Tron, pretty quickly, they're playing these big, massive creatures like here, and they really just have the advantage. You know, I guess I could have played a 4th Blood Moon, and it would have helped in the matchup, but what I find is that, like, Eldrazi just have answers for everything, and especially with this Hedron archive, even with Blood Moon, they'd still be able to play their Eldrazi's. I just think it's crazy that this deck runs 24 lands, but our deck runs 25 lands, even though their deck's all about lands. It's just crazy to think about. There's definitely, like when the new Gideon comes out, like we definitely need to cut back on lands. Like 25 is just way too much. Like 24 I could see working. If we're lucky, we can make it work with 23. But yeah, just too many lands. And at this point, it's pretty much over. We hang out here for one more turn. What do we have? I mean, we could pull Wrath of God, I guess. That even wouldn't deal with all their creatures. Yeah, it's just so hard late game dealing with this guy. So we go into game 2. We have a couple of options against him. We use Stony Silence, which slows them down, but isn't a complete option. And in the end here, we're still going to lose this game, even though we have a pretty good start. We get Chandra out, and Chandra's good to have early out because it can add 2 to your mana pool. But when you have a 5/5 out, it's like, ugh. So we board wipe him, but we have another thing coming here. And we're able to deal with the Thragtusk pretty well, so we're pretty smart about this where we make it Chandra a 6. We expect the Thragtusk to attack us. It makes it down to 1, but the whole point here was to get it to tap so that we can play Ajani Vengeant, which makes it so permanents can't untap. Now, the downside to the new Gideon is that it has a similar ability to Ajani, but it only stops creatures from dealing damage. It can't tap permanents, because there's times when Ajani Vengeant taps down your opponent's land, especially when you have like Blood Moon out, but it's just for 4 mana. There's so many things that cost 4 in this deck between the Wrath of Gods and the Chandras and the Nahiris and the Ajanis. It's just too much 4-drops. We need to have more 3-drops, even though 3 has a lot of drops as well. But I'd rather just have Gideon the Trials instead of Ajani. And at this point, it's pretty much over. Yeah, we're just not fast enough to deal with this guy, and we're not strong enough late game to deal with this guy either. So unfortunately, the odds were against us here. So in reflection, I gotta say this deck is pretty good. It's actually very good, especially with the metagame right now. But I will say that it is very painful to play against for your opponent, and very painful for you to play. Say you're at a Grand Prix and you play like, what, 9 matches in a day? It's pretty hard to play White Red Prison for 9 matches because there's a lot of moments where you're just sitting there, not able to do anything, your opponent's not able to do anything, and you're just kind of like, it's like this weird tension there. And online, I've never really seen a deck where people respond this way, and everyone just kept quitting. Like, it was like turn 1, Chalice, or turn 1, Blood Moon, and people just quit, or they send these messages that were not the most friendly. So if you want to build this deck, just know what you're getting into before you do it, because it is painful, but it is also an answer to what I think is on the verge of being a broken metagame. When you have this many Death Shadow decks, at least online, it doesn't feel healthy. So even though this deck gets a lot of criticism for being a deck that's not very interactive and a deck that makes Modern miserable to play, it's just something that's bound to happen when you have such a narrow metagame. So even though we have diversity in the metagame, lately we've been seeing just so many Death Shadow decks and so many decks that just play all these 1-drops and don't do anything else. and that's not a healthy metagame. You can't just make a deck that's all 1-drops or all 2-drops and expect to win every match. So yes, this deck is kind of like the bad guy in Modern now, or will become the bad guy in Modern as it increases in popularity, which it most certainly will. If people want to stop this deck from happening, all they need to do is create a more diverse metagame and not just make the deck that everyone else is making, like a burn deck, affinity deck, or Death Shadow deck. You know, just make a deck that's a little bit slower, but it brings diversity to Modern. So the brewers at home who make these decks that no one else uses, those are the people that are going to save the metagame and prevent decks like this from dominating. So it'll be interesting to see how far this deck goes. But if the metagame stays the way it's at, come June with GP Las Vegas, this is my top deck to play. It's assuming that Death Shadow is still as big as it is now, and Burn still as big as it is now, and same thing with Affinity and all that, but this just seems like the deck to play right now. So that's all for now, and if you liked the video, be sure to subscribe for more. I have tons more videos coming, especially with Amonkhet coming out, so come back for that, and I hope you have a great day.